Yaşam hikayeleri bölümümüze hoş geldiniz.
Welcome to our session on stories of coexistence. We will have a consultant and researcher, Hasini Haputhanthri, who carries out research on cultural heritage. As part of this workshop, we will be reinterpreting the history through arts and what we can do to change the dominant forms of education. I would like to briefly introduce you our speaker. Hasini Haputhanthri is currently working on redesigning museums through inclusivity, and she widely publishes on many issues, and she does projects with Sri Lanka and Myanmar, and she also established the World Art and Culture Museum. She carries out this in partnership with various countries around the world. At Columbia University, she has become an expert on museum anthropology. In different platforms, Hasini has worked on culture and heritage management, memory, and historical narratives. Over to you, Hasini.
Okay, thank you very much, Foundation, for this invitation, and thank you all of you for joining this session after lunch. So, since there are so many interesting parallel sessions, you must have joined this because you in some way responded to this question: is art history? So I would really first like to start by throwing that question to you and getting a feeling of how you respond to that question. We know there's art history, but here I'm asking, is art history? It's art, history. Yeah? So who says yes to this question? Just show of hands. Is art history? Yes. Who says no? Easily. Art is not history. I mean, history is an academic discipline. I mean, this is subjective, this is objective. Art is not history. Who says art is not history? Okay, nobody does, yeah? And who says maybe I'm not sure, it's a gray zone? Who says that? Okay, yeah, I see little hands, going up and down. Yeah, so, this is one of those questions that there isn't a clear-cut answer, but that is because it's the way we understand our reality around us. It's the way we define history. It's the way we define art. It's the way we define art history. It's the way we define archaeology, the way we are learning about the world around us in different disciplines. Watertight compartments separate. So I'm going to take you through a series of images and make you reflect the same question. So, okay. Yeah, so just observe. Yeah. From Lascaux, France, this is about 20,000 years old. This is from the part of the world that I come from, Ajanta caves from India. Images that were drawn 3rd century BC. This is an image of Ares and Aphrodite, Greek. Look at the emotion in it. This is from Japan. This is much more modern. It's 1770 to 1824. In fact, this is actually a commercial in the form of an artwork. And you know this very well. Yeah? And this very well. So now the provocation: is art history? Would you respond differently? Or would you respond more readily to saying either yes or no, or to that question after seeing some of it. Of course, knowing that we all don't have the same amount of cultural education or context to read those images. And that is perhaps the reason why we are not so readily into accepting the idea that art can be a very powerful form of exploring history, perhaps even much more powerful than the way we learn through textbooks in classrooms. Yeah? So I can actually trace this idea of why people question artist history. By the way, I am using a lot of visual art in this context, but I want to insist that art can actually mean other forms. It could be literature, it could be photography, it could be much broader than visual arts, but I'm just using visual arts here because it's easier for me to take you through this concept by that. But I mean, there's a whole range of things when we talk about art and creative forms. So I come across this idea all the time. A lot of the time, people feel that art is very different than science. So for a lot, in our minds, we have something, the left brain that goes on when you say science, and the right brain that goes on that says art. So it's like a clear demarcation, especially when you also talk about social science history, sociology, anthropology. You feel that these are scientific inquiries, and art is something completely subjective. And that idea is what you have here when you say the better the literature, the less it might offer as historical substance. You know, this is a common idea that even our universities, our classrooms, our schools and education institutions sort of inculcate in us in an implicit way, to say that emotion and reason don't go together, art and science don't go together, these are separate things. And I want to take some time to reflect with you about this whole question of objectivity, of science, of history. Because a lot of the times in our universities or in our schools, when we learn to become historians, oral historians, and in dealing with the topics that we want to deal in the context we are working right now, we often have to come with this idea of objectivity. And I want to challenge this a little bit. What is history actually? Yeah? So E.H. Carr, a famous historian, he says there are facts and there are historical facts, right? So let me explain that also through a work of art. This was done by Francesco Granacci in 1494. The painting is about Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, right? So, is Julius Caesar the only person who ever crossed the Rubicon? No, lots of people crossed the Rubicon. But that is not a historical fact. The historical fact is that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, right? So this in itself, out of such a lot of facts, how does one fact become a historical fact? The simple answer, according to E.H. Carr, is when a historian decides so. So, you could all be facts, but I, as a historian, would choose you to become the fact. Then you become the historical fact, not everybody else, right? So, thereby itself, we are busting the myth of being objective. Even when we are in our academic disciplines, in our training as professional historians or human rights lawyers, when we say we want to be objective in pursuing our truths, this is not so much the case. We ourselves are a part of our own process of learning, interpreting the reality, dealing with the reality, saying this matters over this, right? So, and this is something that comes also through the way we are taken through our educational processes in our schools, in our universities, because it is completely divided how you teach it. I'll give you an example just from a university background. Here, this is, again, W.M. Meister, who really criticized the idea of these divided disciplines, talks about how he was a student of Harvard in history, and how disciplines were completely turfs that are divided, you know. So archaeology belonged to one group of people, history belonged to another group of people, art history belongs to a completely another group of people. But reality really is opposed to this. You need all these understandings, all these methodologies, all these ways of looking at the world to grasp it in a much more holistic way. But our training, which is so important because all of us go through years and years and years of education and academic trainings. All of you have gone through schooling, and that really forms us to look at reality in very compartmental and divided ways. So that's a photographer that I work with in Sri Lanka, Abdul Halik Aziz. He criticizes through this photograph the bad education, the way history is taught in school, which is at fault for the way we are understanding historical narratives in our present context. So, in fact, what we try to push for is an understanding of history in a much more broader manner, to understand that history is only a small piece of the past, the idea of past, right? So when you say history, there is history that is generated by political ideologies. You know this. This is what a lot of people here are trying to counter through your day-to-day work, the political ideologies that work with. Then there is also a history that is generated by the academics, the historians that go out. There are the politicians telling you history, there are the academics telling you history. And then there is also this concept that I find very interesting to explore by Michael Oakeshott, a historian, who calls it practical past. You know, he says practical past is actually the past of the common man, and of artists and filmmakers and writers, all of them, because they are also engaged in producing ideas about what our past is. What is the past of Turkey? What's the history of Turkey? Yeah? So according to Michael Oakeshott, he says this version of the past that most of us carry within us. It's something implicit. We know it because we have absorbed it from our grandmothers who told us stories about our past. We learn it in school, we watch it on television, all of that, you know. And this is the past that we draw upon to make decisions day to day. This is the past we draw upon when we go and cast a vote. And we wonder why people choose so differently. But this is what drives that, those narratives that normal people are carrying in their head, that are used, in fact, to make very important decisions in our lives, like voting in elections. Okay, so although I even said the academic, political, and practical as three different things, in fact, this is also not to be divided. For instance, for me, practical past looks a little bit like this. So, you know this. Do you think this is political, ideological? Yes. Yeah? So it is political and ideological. But is it also practical? Is this the article that people see and have and like to carry in their mind? Of course it is also that, right? I'm sure when they were producing this series, they also consulted so many historians to get that right, this right, you know, this, did they walk this way, did they eat this way, did they talk this way, all of that also. So academics was also part, probably historians were part of the consultation team for doing that. So you see how all of these different streams of history come together in creating this piece of work, right? And this is the history that we believe in, we live. And this is what tempts us to make the decisions that we do, and our own idea of our past, own reflections on our past. So why do I always advocate that art is such a fantastic and rich way of exploring the past from a slightly alternative perspective? Because I feel history is a representation, yeah? Because now, for instance, we know this is probably not what happened in the past. It's a representation of the past. So what is history? History is actually the story we tell ourselves about the past. It's a representation of the past. It's not the reality, it's a representation of it. Art is also not a reality. It is also a representation. I mean, an artist will create a piece of art as a way of expressing his or her reality, but that is not the reality. It is a representation of the reality. So for me, this connection between art and history and narrative as representations of our reality was an important thing to understand in trying to work with this together. We know that history is not the past. We know that it's mediated by evidence. We can bring different ideological theories or evidences from archaeology or heritage, so it's mediated by evidence. It's mediated by the way we go in search of it, the methodologies we adopt. We were talking about oral history in the previous session. If we choose oral history as a methodology, the way you approach history will be entirely different from the way you approach history as an archaeologist, for instance. So the representation of history that we come up with, or the past that we come up with, would be mediated by the methodology that we take. Yeah, and then also the ideology and the subjectivity, who we are, what are we searching for, is definitely having an impact on the way we present our history. So is art. Art is a representation. Art is a method of representation. So for instance, here is an artist that I work with from Lebanon. I am part of a lovely collaboration of 7 different countries that came together to create a project called World Art and Memory Museum. You can Google it and find the link. So there are 7 different countries, and artists from 7 different countries come together to explore art, memory, history through these kinds of representations. So Nada, this Lebanese artist, made this painting called Lebanese War Statistics, because she felt this is the way war is represented in their media, just a number, just a tick that goes on. Yeah? So art is a product of historical discourses, and art also produce and disseminate historical discourses. So the world we live in is fashioned by all these discourses generated by Ertugrul and this kind of art from artists and all of that, right? So the idea that art is a part of these discourses, it comes out of it, but it also contributes to it, is an idea that I found interesting. This is an artist from Sri Lanka who saw the militarization of Sri Lankan society and started painting these soldiers without faces, because suddenly becoming a soldier gave the young people of Sri Lanka, rural youth, and sudden identity, sudden power, sudden, that's why he asked this question, who are you, soldier? It's a question of identity. Becoming a soldier made them seen, and the artist was able to capture the fact about this, yeah? But let's see how the world changed in the way it represents history. Now, this is a painting, again, 1810, Francois Gérard. This is the kind of stuff that you will not learn in history, but you will learn if you take art history. And how unfortunate is that, right? So this is the typical way in which European history did historical paintings. You can see that what's on top is the victor. So it's the story of the victor. You see heroes on the top, by the way, this is a painting about the Battle of Austerlitz, the very famous battle that Leo Tolstoy writes about in his book War and Peace. Again, art as history. So you can see the victims are not so clear. They are all at the bottom part of it. But this is the kind of paintings you will see if you go to any art gallery in the Western world, most of the time, from this period of time. And then this happens. I like this Goya's painting. It's about the same time, but he does something radically different from that time. Here, you don't see the perpetrator's face. You don't see victors. Here, the foreground is about the victim. Suddenly, this is a huge change of perspective in modern art. This is the birth of modern art, in fact, when they change the perspective from the powerful to the powerless. What you see is the face of victims, you see the perpetrators, and a gruesome act being committed here. Right? This is phenomenon in art history because suddenly you are leaving the Napoleons out, the kings out, and giving space for nameless victims. And he did it. And let's see how this then inspired this 2 centuries later, 1951. This is Picasso. See the connection between this and this. I'm not going to explain the details. And you can trace this to Guernica, his other painting that most of you would know, the similarities. So how art feeds off and builds on top of others. So this is a point where modern art became modern art by choosing to side and choosing to give space for people and stories that were not getting enough space in the art world. This is how art has turned around in itself. So what I'm figuring out is we are always talking about changing the narrative, changing the story. In all these discussions I engaged with most of you that I came to talk with, we were talking about, so what do we do out of all of this? You know, you put out facts, but people don't believe facts, because facts don't appeal to people. People know facts, but people respond to Ertugrul. People respond to narratives. People respond to emotion. People respond to stories. So if you want to change the narrative, then you have to respond. You have to give people not just facts. Facts, they most of the time already know. I think yesterday also, creative activism, Ishtar was talking about it, right? You have to engage them at a different level. And how do you change the narrative? By changing the representation. Francisco Goya changed the narrative in 1814 by simply changing the perspective. He changed the narrative at that time. Yeah? And so here is some example from around the world, the project that I'm working on, World Art and Memory Museums, 7 different countries, but I'm just going to give you one example to keep it short. Because then I'd rather that we have a discussion and you ask me questions rather than me just going on and on. So here is a piece of art from 5th century AD in Sri Lanka. A courtly lady, a heavenly figure. And here is an artist who comes from a minority community in Sri Lanka, whose family has been working in the tea plantations for generations. You probably know most about Sri Lanka through Ceylon tea, right? That's the brand that we have, the biggest brand our country has, like Hagia Sophia for Istanbul, yeah? But she chooses to use used tea bags to show how the dire situations of the tea plantation workers, the women. While art in Sri Lanka usually is around these old courtly ladies and classical figures, she tries to borrow the same image but respond to it in a way that she makes it her own and tries to show and express their own plights through this figure of a woman, which is so different from the courtly ladies. And here, so Hanusha, this earlier artist, comes from Sri Lanka, a tea plantation in Sri Lanka. Generations of her has been plucking tea in the plantation. And about 10,000 miles far away from her, Tiago Santana from Brazil comes from a sugar plantation. Yeah? And he actually uses sugar just the same way as Hanusha uses tea bags in her work. He uses sugar to talk about history. So he has a series called Whitewashing History. So he takes history books and that also shows slavery and covers them in sugar and shows how we try to whitewash history and sweeten history through this, you know. So these two artists live 10,000 miles apart. They don't know of each other. They've never talked to each other. But they are using their day-to-day realities, their day-to-day material to express their reality. And the kind of solidarity and contrast and complementarity that I see is something that I feel would hugely contribute to our own understanding of building a world that fights together for the just causes we want to talk about. So, it's all about pushing for a history that matters. Art, the power is that art records not just facts, but also emotion, thereby foregrounding empathy. You are able to empathize with the artist or the artwork. You are given an opportunity to do that. Possibility for dialogue and critical attention. It gives you a space. And bringing all of these into the ways we learn about and explore our past and our reality is hugely contributive towards creating a different narrative altogether. Yeah? So I again want to stress the need for moving away from academic divided understanding and approaching of our reality to a more interdisciplinary, more collaborative, working across borders approach. Yeah? It doesn't matter whether you're a scientist or an artist or a historian or a, yeah, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're from, you're Armenian or Turkish or Sri Lankan. You know, it is about finding ways of approaching the reality around you through creative means and finding that kind of ground to build dialogue and critical reflection of our reality. So this is what I want to stop with. Then through doing that, we can come and bring to light narratives of coexistence, to see the past differently than the way we are presented in media or power hierarchies or in the textbooks, to come and challenge that kind of hegemonic narratives through something that's more human, emotional, and something that we can relate to. So I'm going to stop at that, and if there are any questions, I'll let you ask that. Sorry? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We thank Hasini so much for this inspirational talk. And şimdi biz bir 10 dakika kısa bir ara vereceğiz. Aranın ardından
Now we are going to break for 10 minutes, and right after that we're going to be listening to Wafa Ali Mustafa, who is going to be talking about stories of coexistence. If you have questions for Hasini, you can get hold of her outside. Thank you, and see you in 10 minutes.